Good afternoon and evening, everyone. As you know, this is a discussion of three big topics: philanthropy, politics, and democracy, and how they intersect. Let's set the stage. Our plan is to set the stage by giving each of the panelists a chance, a minute or two, to talk about your personal perspective and how these themes enter your work, what questions trouble you, and what developments excite you. We hear a lot, for example, about growing income and wealth inequality in America, about how the top 1% of the top 1% are growing fabulously wealthy, while the middle and working class are stagnating. Yet scores of these millionaires and billionaires are turning around and giving vast sums of money away, pledging to put most of their wealth toward worthy causes during their lifetimes. Do you, members of the panel, regard this as a hopeful development or cause for concern? And I start with Jane Mayer.
Thank you.
You're writing a book about the role of money in politics. It's a logical first step.
Well, I have to start with a bit of a caveat. One is I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an academic, and I'm really bad at math. So I'm dealing with big money numbers, okay? But so don't hold me to all of them at the end of the day. But my concern, I come into this subject as a political reporter, having covered politics since Reagan was president. And my concern is that there is now a use of nonprofit corporations, 501c4s they're called, in politics. The use of this kind of nonprofit for political spending has exploded. And I am concerned because the donations to these groups are secret, and because of Citizens United, the amount that people can give is unlimited, and it, I think, is becoming a force of secret spending by a very wealthy minority that poses serious questions about the fundamental idea of our democracy, which is one man, one vote. And there's always been a concern in American history that economic inequality might lead to political inequality. And there's been an effort to balance that out over the years. And I think this latest development creates a real threat to that balance. And we've seen in the headlines just in the last couple days, there was a conference that the Charles and David Koch held, where donors at their conference pledged to come up with, I guess it's $889 million to spend in the 2016 election, which is a sum that is larger than both parties spent in the 2012 election. It's unclear how this money will be spent, but conceivably an awful lot of it could be spent secretly and without us ever knowing who the donors were, other than the Kochs themselves. And I think that, raises questions about accountability and fairness and corruption. So that's an issue I'm thinking about.
Thank you very much, Jane. That's a very good beginning. And we'll now move on to Jim and say the same question. How do these themes enter your work? What questions trouble you and what developments excite you?
Well, thank you, Joel, first of all, for inviting me. Thank you, Kristen, for all your efforts to organize this. I don't disagree with Jane. Let me take a look at this from a little bit different perspective. I've been in this business for about 34 years. It doesn't seem like it, but I came into it by accident in 1981. And I believe that if you look over these 34, 35 years, this represents a distinctive period in American history. And marked by several things. Obviously, globalization of our economy, and very importantly, the takeoff of the stock market beginning in 1982. The world stock markets were valued at about $2 trillion in 1981. Today, they're valued at about $60 trillion, with the US stock market representing about $21 or $22 trillion. When I started in this business, I don't think there was a foundation that had $1 billion in assets. Maybe the Ford Foundation did. Now there are probably 25 or 30 of them. Harvard was the only college that had an endowment of $1 billion. So we've seen an astronomical takeoff in world wealth. Obviously, we've had a revolution in technology as well, which is, I think, associated with that. But of course, accompanying that has been a rise in inequality. I think it's largely due to the stock market, not totally, but very, very closely related to the takeoff in the stock market. So this phase that we've been through is very distinctive. The inflation-adjusted value of the stock market in 1981 or 1982 was less than it was in 1929. We had a 50-year period where the stock market did not grow in inflation-adjusted terms. Since 1981 or 1982, it's taken off by about 20 times. That's had an enormous impact on, obviously, wealth, but philanthropy, inequality, and the flow of money into politics. Now, I think we can overstate the impact of foundations. Foundations spend about $50 billion a year now. When I started, it was a lot less than that, and there were very few large foundations. Probably 10% of that goes into public policy, if that. Most foundations are not heavily programmatic. A lot of it is local giving, scattered giving, family giving. So the whole foundation world, while it's had an influence on politics, it's not that large. The question I have is this period coming to an end, and I think it is, for three reasons. One, our stock markets and our capitalist system tends to operate in cycles, and I think this one may be coming to an end. Secondly, the political agenda is extremely crowded. That's partly due to foundations and philanthropies and all this money that's flowing into politics. Not too long ago, we tried to remake the Middle East. There are those today who think that the U.S. Congress can shape the global climate 50 or 100 years hence, and in between there's a lot of things happening. Thirdly, we lack the consensus in the United States to solve the big problems that we're facing. Partly that's due to philanthropy, I think, but a lot of other factors. Can philanthropy answer these questions? I don't think so, because philanthropists are focused on narrow agendas, and that tends to fragment the political system. So I think basically that America's problems will accumulate in the coming decades. We lack the consensus to address them, and the United States will have difficulty sustaining its level of wealth.
Jim, thank you. Good contribution to moving the discussion forward. Adam, it's your turn.
Well, on that optimistic note,
What's the point of being a conservative if you have to be optimistic?
you know, I am focused a little bit differently, Jim, on the role of philanthropy in politics, because the thing I'm really thinking about these days is government, it seems to me, has been under a 40-year assault. The idea that we can have an effective, fair, well-functioning government has been under a 40-year assault that has been generally in the United States unanswered or not answered well, in my opinion. I don't know any, I'll say is, actually I've got a friend, a very close friend, Steve Lerner in the audience, who's the real expert on branding, but I'll say I don't know as a business person any brand that could sustain a 40-year assault on its reputation that went unanswered and survive. But that's essentially what I think has happened. Well, why is that important? There is only one institution that every single one of us in America belongs to. We don't belong to the same church or the same club or the same organization. The only organization, the only institution we share is our government, the fact that we're all citizens. And this 40-year assault on the one thing that the one vehicle we can use to work together is a tragedy in my mind. And so that is, because it prevents us, it atomizes us, it separates us, it prevents us from trying to reach consensus, because the idea is it's impossible, because the one institution we could do that through, the assumption is it's non-functioning, it's inefficient, it's too expensive, it's corrupt, whatever. Now, the pouring of money into the election of officials, I think, is complicated, because on the one hand, free speech is also very important, and our ability as individuals to direct our money and to articulate a point of view and to advocate for an idea or a candidate that we want to advocate for is really critical, I think, to a fundamental civil liberty underpinning, which is free speech. On the other hand, the pouring of money in and the vitriol with which it comes in has so diminished this central connection between us that it really is hurting, I think, our society. We need some rules to find some balance here, in my view, because I think we need to reinvigorate the idea that we're going to find a way to work together to really focus on issues of common concern, coming at it from different points of view, and work our way through some of these problems. I'm much more optimistic about the opportunity in front of America and the world than some others might be. But I think we need to solve this problem of how we engage in common action if we are going to succeed.
Right.
I would
Go ahead, please.
Could I just comment? It's not that I'm pessimistic. I do have a view that unless we realistically look at these challenges that face us, we will play the role of Dr. Pangloss and ignore them. So part of my thought is that if someone would emphasize these difficulties that we're facing, maybe we'll take them more seriously.
And I was
Go
going
ahead,
to just
James,
add that in looking at the families that have funded some of the philanthropy on the right, which has had a very strong, I think, theme of anti-government, that one of the ironies that came out of my research anyway was that and several of the fortunes that were made in large part thanks to the US government. And you don't hear about it, but they were fortunes made from defense contracting in particular is the basis of several of the big families' fortunes. And most of the companies that have helped build these fortunes have benefited from all kinds of tax advantages that are available to the specific kinds of sectors that these families were in. So it's been an irony to me just to see that the anti-government fervor that's come out of this, because many of them have gotten a great deal of help from the government.
You've both commented on the anti-government animus. And I think Jane explicitly pointed to the right. Both of you have been very active in various programs which have challenged the national security policies of the United States. Jane, you've written books about it.
Right.
So that's not where I come from. But I could, with equal justice, point to you and say, you're coming from an anti-government perspective. You're weakening the government. You're undermining our national security. So I guess my question to you would be, isn't this kind of a one-sided ideological view that you're directing toward conservatives for being anti-government when in other areas, you know, you could point the same finger at you?
I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, in that, I think of criticizing the government as can be an expression of hope that it will reform. I'm not sure that really is how, take the Cato Institute feels. They particularly want to, or if you look at the libertarian platform that the Kochs ran on in 1980, they wanted dismantle the IRS, dismantle the FBI, dismantle the FEC, get rid of all campaign finance rules, get rid of the Social Security system, get rid of any kind of social program, basically. And also, I mean, I would agree with them on some of their criticisms of too much defense spending, maybe. But it's a much more, it's not exactly a pinpoint approach that you get in some places. It's much more of a value-driven, reflexive, I don't want anyone telling me what to do, including the federal government.
One of the key questions here really has to do with the, up until the string of Supreme Court decisions, we managed to constrain to some degree, perhaps not effectively enough, the amount of money that goes into politics. That, of course, an end has been put to that for all practical purposes. I myself, some of the first articles I wrote dealt with campaign finance reform. And the whole system of campaign finance reform is basically a shambles at this point. There isn't any system. So the question is it, Adam talks eloquently about the importance of free speech, and with which I agree, but the question is, don't we reach a point at some time that there's too much money coming in to politics, and if so, or maybe you disagree with that, and if you do, say so, but is it more better? Is there no limit to it? And of course, the money is going to come in from the people who have money.
The problem, it seems to me, is look, there's an awful lot of money wasted in the first place. So there's this effect, I think, in many campaigns where, and I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to me that the communication just ends up the last part of it or the last third of it just being noise because people are saturated. The real problem in my mind with and the reason I wish we could get effective campaign finance reform is the appearance and the assumption of corruption, and that it so undermines our confidence in our elected officials. The fact that a candidate for House or Senate or the legislature or governor spends so much of their time raising money.
And judges.
And judges, and I wanted to get to that. There was a recent study that law firms in North Carolina who appeared before our elected Supreme Court do better if they've given more money. That's the correlation. And just having that as a potential correlation undermines citizens' confidence in our government. And that, to me, is the real tragedy. I think there's less actual corruption and a tremendous amount of appearance and assumption of corruption.
I mean, the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United that they didn't think that there would be a corruption issue, either a real one or an appearance issue, because they assumed Anthony Kennedy in his judgment assumed that there would be transparency in the spending. He actually talked about how he thought that now that we've got the internet, over 24 hours later, you would be able to see where the money came from, and then people can, account for it when they're hearing what the politicians are saying. And so that assumption proved wrong. I think it was a miscalculation. And Scalia, who obviously is quite conservative, also talked about the importance of transparency and how he thought that people who complain that it exposes donors to the public glare are basically babies, and that if you're going to take a big role in public policy and throw your money around, step up to it and own it, and you explain why you're doing it, and that's just how our democracy works. But it's not how it's come out. It's been an unintended consequence that people thought the money would go to super PACs where you could see who the donors were, and instead it's been sidelined through this other vehicle, and it's so complicated too. I mean, I think that also loses confidence in the public. It's so complicated and so just devilishly dull to try to figure out how money moves in politics. I think people go to sleep trying to figure it out, and it's so complicated that I think the public just kind of gives up on it and assumes it's just bought and paid for.
Jim, do you agree that the problem of scale of money in politics is harmful at this point? Do you see that there's any need to constrain the amount of it, and if so, what ways you would do that?
Well, yes and no. I don't know how it would be done. Now, the campaign contribution limits are still in force. The Supreme Court decision did not overthrow the
direct to candidates. Direct,
yes.
Yeah.
What they did when they overthrew that part of McCain-Feingold was to overthrow the issue advocacy element of it. What happened was that in McCain-Feingold, they banned issue advocacy ads within 60 days of an election that mentioned a candidate. So your Right to Life or your environmental group could not go on TV with an issue ad 60 days before an election and advocate this or that side, though they were not, even though they would not be associated with the campaign. So in 2004, a group called Citizens United challenged Michael Moore's movie called Fahrenheit 9/11, which castigated the Bush administration, and they said this violates McCain-Feingold. You can't show this movie within 60 days of the election. And the Federal Election Commission overruled that and said, no, you can do that. Citizens United then made a movie about Hillary Clinton, and then they began to air it in the run-up to the 2008 campaign when Hillary Clinton was a candidate, and a federal judge said you can't show the Hillary Clinton movie. Even though there's total parallel between Michael Moore and the Hillary Clinton movie, and they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court threw out that aspect of McCain-Feingold on free speech grounds. Like under McCain-Feingold, you couldn't write a book or publish a book within 60 days of a campaign that advocated an issue that might have mentioned a candidate. Now, I regard that as a violation of the First Amendment, as I understand it. Any citizen group should be able to advocate on this or that side of an issue in a run-up to a campaign without the government telling you you can't do it. Because inevitably, that sort of thing is going to come down on the side of incumbents. Yeah. So I don't think that was a bad decision. Now, going back to what I said before about the stock market and inequality, I think, one, there's an enormous amount of money flowing into politics, partly for the reason I just discussed. Wealthy people own stocks. Middle class and poor people tend not to own stocks unless they're in their pension accounts. So we have this flow of money into campaigns. The other thing I'd say is that the people who are making these contributions are disconnected from the way that ordinary people in America live. So to the extent that this influences the policies we get, either on the left or the right, a lot of it tends to force politics away from the concerns of your average voter. That I would regard as a big problem.
So I had a question that I don't know the answer to this, but it seems that the courts are going to make it very difficult for, at least in the short term, for there to be meaningful campaign finance reform. And if you're interested in having less polarization, a government that's populated by elected officials who are more likely to really work to make progress, whatever that means together, I wonder whether nonpartisan redistricting wouldn't be as powerful a solution as campaign finance reform to move government towards a more a less polarized, more effective vehicle to express the public will, and to crowd out the extremes and let that center work through some tough issues that America faces.
In other words, not to permit designing electoral districts for political advantage reasons.
Correct.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Jane, do you
What I worry is it's just there's been such a long history of gerrymandering districts for political advantage. It's been kind of part of the spoils system in American politics from the beginning. Maybe now with, computers can figure out down to the tiny little decimal point how to make a district fair, and they might be able to do that. I don't know what the mechanism would be for imposing it, since you basically would have to ask the politicians to hand over the right to.
It has to be done, frankly, state by state.
State by state.
It has to be done state by state at a moment in time when it's reasonably advantageous to both parties.
Right. Well, and we've seen developers in that direction in California and also, but now most recently in Ohio, where with the Republican control there, they decided maybe the time had come to do something like that.
Both parties in North Carolina have said that they would support it. I don't know if that's really true, whether when the time comes to really enact it, whether they would support it.
I also don't know whether it would really answer the problem of secret money flooding into politics from concentrated hands. It's been so astounding to me to see the size of the money, and it's grown so fast. I think people forget that it wasn't very long ago. I guess it was the race of Reagan versus Carter, 80, right? That had strict campaign limits on how much they spent. They spent very little. They used public financing. And this whole thing's grown up in very recent times, really, and is mushrooming into a place we have not been, I think, not even in the Gilded Age, really. There was a different system of money before the progressive movement came in and imposed campaign finance reform. There was more sort of handing out jobs in exchange for campaign contributions. But it's really something. I mean, I was looking at one particular meeting of, again, if we'll pick on the Kochs because they're always so spectacular in the numbers front, but in their seminar that they held, it was January 2009, so it was just right ahead of the 2010 elections, which was a very important election actually for them. But a guest list escaped and became public. So for the first time, people could see who came to these seminars. And I just added up the estimated fortunes of the people in that room who were on the Forbes 400 list. And that small group alone, which was just a tiny little, end of the pinky of the group that they had together, was $75 billion. That's an incredible concentration of wealth that's sitting in a room trying to decide what to do about the next election. I think there's been very little headway made when the Democrats have tried to make an issue of this. And I'm not sure if that will change, but it really is a dramatic, I think, issue. And I think it's going to hurt philanthropy more generally if it's seen as nothing but a dodge for hiding money to get what you want in politics. And I think there's already been a movement to get rid of the deductions for charitable contributions or to cap them. And I think there'll be more of that if people think that philanthropy is just another name for buying your political influence.
Okay, could I respond to that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Again, there's a suggestion that all this money is going to conservatives and Republicans.
Well, I think the Democracy Alliance has its own group, which is the Democrats' version.
Right. So I went several years ago, I had a student go through the Forbes 400 to see if he could identify which party or which political position they represented. And of course, on a lot of them, you can't really tell. But to the extent that he could identify them, maybe there were about half of them, there were more people associated with Democrats and liberal causes than Republicans and conservative causes. Environment, civil rights, other things of that nature. So I took from that the predominant wealth of the country is not necessarily on the right. That may be because a lot of the recent wealth comes out of the stock market. So, and there's plenty of money on the left, and there are people in this room who are out there raising it. The other thing I would say is we ought to draw a distinction between philanthropy and political giving.
Correct.
Now,
Right, I agree.
Yeah.
so there are many people who are active on both sides, but philanthropy is tax exempt. When you make that contribution to a foundation, you get a deduction, and a lot of wealthy people do that. When you file your tax return, you have to identify the organizations that you've given money to, if you're a foundation. So that's all entirely transparent. Foundations are not allowed to donate to elections. They're not allowed to spend money on lobbying. There are a lot of rules that attend philanthropy. It's a different kind of thing than political giving. By far, the largest foundations in the country are on the left. I represented a conservative foundation, and we never had more than $100 million in assets. Bill Gates has $36 billion. The Ford Foundation has $10 billion or something like that. Most of the large foundations, to the extent you can identify them with a political cause, are liberal institutions, and they fund liberal causes. Conservative foundations are very few and far between, and they are not large. And they may have had some influence. People say they've had influence. I can't judge that since I was on the inside. But by and large, most of that money is liberal money, not conservative money.
I think that I want to be sure we have enough time for audience to ask questions. So if any of the members of the panel would like to add anything, sort of a farewell individual statement, though you'll have opportunity to do that in the context of answering questions, you can do that right now before we actually ask for questions from the floor. Anybody? No?
Well, yeah. Just to throw out another question, which is, you know, I mean, it would be good, I mean, it'd be nice if it was also tidy, that, you know, political giving is one kind and philanthropic giving is another kind. But in fact, what this groups that I was talking about, the dark money groups, are called social welfare groups. Mm-hmm. So they're not specifically political, supposedly, though they've started spending up to about 50% of their money on electoral politics. But they do fall into this kind of push me, pull you, quasi, you know, philanthropic group. And then meanwhile, you have 501c3s, which are really supposed to be philanthropic organizations where the donations are tax deductible. And if you look at what some of those organizations push, they're very much like what companies that are lobbying on Capitol Hill push. They're the same things, only they are, you know, maybe for deregulating environmental policies, lowering taxes. It's from a philosophical standpoint rather than from a specific business standpoint, but it's not so neat. I don't think that it falls into these categories like this, and I think all of this is making me wonder about the tax deduction for charitable giving.
But that's a different, I mean, the C4 money is not, as you pointed out, is not tax deductible.
No,
so
it's not. The C3 money is,
it's not getting a public subsidy.
Right, but the C3 money is.
But as Bill points out, the C3s are much more tightly regulated in terms of the kinds of advocacy that they can engage in.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, you'll take a look at, again, you know, just because I know their story well, the Kochs, they have a C3 that's Americans for Prosperity Foundation, and they have a C4 that's Americans for Prosperity. And the message from both is the same. It's just that one is a little more specifically talking about candidates. It's an area where there's not also, I mean, face it, much enforcement, and maybe, you know, maybe that's a good thing from some people's point of view who really want to see, you know, a vibrant philanthropic sector. But neither the IRS nor the FEC are spending a lot of time on this subject.
Even though, as I said, much philanthropy is liberal philanthropy, I'm very much a defender of the whole philanthropic sector, the foundation sector. The question is raised, are foundations, the philanthropies, are they democratic? They're not democratic. Obviously they're not, but there are a lot of things in American life that are not democratic. We wouldn't have a Supreme Court with the power that it has if we were concerned about democracy in a majoritarian sense. But I believe that the foundations, and I include the liberal foundations in this, have been a force for innovation in American life for 100 or so years. I admire what a lot of them have done, and I'd hate to see it curtailed, but I do think we should keep that somewhat separate from this whole question of money kind of flowing into the political process, because I do believe that philanthropists and the people who run foundations are very careful and conscientious about what they do.
Let me just say on this issue of the close coordination sometimes, or the apparent close coordination of a C3 and a C4. I'm a little bit more careful about wanting to constrain the C3 maybe than you're expressing. I'm not sure, Jane, what you would do, but and here's why. There is a fight to be had. There's an argument to be had about ideas in foundations and the research they fund and the researchers and the communications that they fund about ideas, not about candidates. It's a really important part of the public debate. Now, I really feel that for 40 years there's been the lack of a voice in favor of the idea of an effective government. But that's just a failure on the part of people like myself who believe that to articulate to effectively articulate that message.
Well, you two are both involved in this area, and I guess one of the questions I have as a reporter covering it is, would that function disappear if the tax deduction disappeared? Because, I mean, before John Rockefeller started the Rockefeller Foundation, you can still see de Tocqueville talking about America being filled with people having interest groups and all kinds of private sector or whatever, public sector, small groups together, discussing issues. And but there wasn't the state didn't subsidize it with a tax deduction. And I guess I'm wondering also, given the size of the fortunes that are being made, when you hear Jim talk about the stock market, do philanthropists need to be given a tax deduction in order to feel it's worth giving?
Well, the research is pretty clear that most people with wealth will give money to politics. Most Americans will give money to charities, whether there's a tax deduction or not. What the tax deduction seems to do, according to research done by good economists, is it increases the amount of money that people will give. But in terms of actually whether they will give or not, it seems fairly clear they'll give without the deduction. In the case, there are many philanthropists who've given billions of dollars. Atlantic Philanthropies donor didn't get a tax deduction for setting up Atlantic Philanthropies. It's a Bermuda charity. It couldn't happen in any event in terms of the way the tax system operates. But that's what the report suggests, that people will give even without the deduction, but the deduction makes a difference in how much they give.
We have had a natural experiment in some respects since the 1980s, because we did reduce the marginal tax rate substantially.
That's right.
And we have had an explosion in philanthropic giving. And as Joel points out, a lot of the research suggests that it's not so much the tax incentive, it's the creation of wealth that leads to the philanthropy.
Right. Well, let's move the discussion now to the audience. And questions are now open. Hands are popping up. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Gerald West from the Brookings Institution, and some of my Brookings colleagues have suggested a reform of universal voting, or some people call it mandatory voting, as a way to deal with some of the issues that you've been talking about. And the rationale is that we have low turnout elections, there are big fluctuations between midterm versus presidential
Correct.
elections. If you have mandatory voting, it's harder for each of the parties to play to the bases. It might reduce polarization. There's less volatility between on years and off years.
Yeah. Can you all hear the question? No. Kristen, we'll use the microphone the next time. The question was, does mandatory voting offer a way to solve some of the problems that we're talking about? If you force people, if everybody's required, as they are in some countries, to vote on election day, not leave it voluntary, then it reduces the capacity of the parties to play specially to their bases and forces everybody to vote at that point. Do any on the members of the panel have any views about that?
Again, I don't know how you'd implement it. The Constitution is almost silent on the mechanics of elections. There's an interesting book that's coming out from God, which university? It's what's wrong with my brain? Tennessee, Vanderbilt. There's a professor in Vanderbilt who's got a book coming out about how it was kind of left up to localities to figure out all of the mechanics, and I think you'd have a hard time getting that through, don't you?
But however, if you could, I think it would be a great idea. Now, you have to provide the option of just voting present. Right? So many people would vote here, but not in favor of either. But I think it would be a powerful. Tool.
Would it change the influence of money, the deployment of money in the election in a significant way?
It would absolutely change the way a lot of money is because there is a huge emphasis on turning out your base.
The base,
Right.
Because you know that a smaller fraction of the electorate is going to show up. Now, if you have everybody showing up, I think the calculus changes.
Yeah, that's the logic. Steve.
Yeah, so I've been instructed by...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm Steve Tellis from Johns Hopkins University, and I've been instructed by Kristen, who I obey in all things, that to let you know that if you want to ask a question, you have to come to the microphone. So you should all do as Kristen says. That's a general maxim.
All of us
as
here
well
in the
as a
Sanford
specific
School
maxim.
learned that.
So my question is that in these conversations, we often, especially about anything about money, and I think it has something to do with our Puritan, part of our, the legacy of Puritanism. We talk about money, we immediately fall into a discourse of corruption, and that's how we think about, the effect that money's going to have. It's going to corrupt things, and so we start thinking about directionality. Is it going to bias it toward one thing or the other? And then we talk about foundations, and then Jim says, well, actually, no, because they're more to the left, so maybe, that's it. So, is there a problem? Probably not. But another way to think about this is to think about the effect as less being about corruption and more being about incoherence, right? And there, I think there's actually a fairly significant reason to believe that both philanthropic money and private money that goes into, and again, most of the money, again, when people talk about this, they talk about elections, but the overwhelming amount of money that goes into politics doesn't go into elections, it goes into influencing public policy through lobbying, interest groups, right? That's where the really enormous money is. And I think where there's a much better evidence that there's a plausible connection to influence, but the size of the amount of money, the size of the density of organization that's come because of the amount of money we put in, both through philanthropy that goes into C3 organizations and money that goes into the proliferation of lobbying. I just published a book that's coming out on business, right? And the fact that now businesses aren't even just organizing as peak organizations, they're organizing as individual businesses that have representation in Washington, and that leads to a proliferation of demands that become increasingly smaller and smaller, so it's harder to get government to do big things, right? Because all these particular interest groups want to be able to go back to their clients and say, we got you this one little, thing that I can trace back to my activity. And the consequence is an article I wrote called Kludgeocracy, is you get this proliferation of small, often incoherent government, and that could be part of the problem that Adam is describing, that one of the reasons that people don't believe in government anymore is the government's capacity to do really big things and really move big things in one direction or another has gotten limited as government has gotten pulled into all these sort of micro influences. So maybe the influence of money in politics, both through philanthropy, through lobbying, through all these others, is to make government incoherent rather than to make it corrupt. So there's something to throw out.
Anybody on the panel want to respond to that? Yes? No?
I like that formulation.
Yeah.
You've written about it, and I think very well. The money is organized on all sides, and you're right, a lot of it is focused on very narrow things. I think I mentioned before that the consensus that we require to solve big problems does not exist is one of the reasons. It's very interesting that, we came out of the Depression in World War II, and when we went into it, there was very little consensus on the role of government in America. Obviously, the New Deal was very controversial, and going into World War II, there is no consensus on whether the United States should get involved in another European war, the isolationists and all that. And amazingly, we came out of that with an enormous amount of consensus in the society about the role of government and so on that lasted into the 1960s. And
Vietnam.
one of the aspects of affluence, I think, is the kind of the process that you've just described as the consensus shatters and people focus on smaller and smaller aspects of government, and government can no longer do big things.
I think the other thing that I remember interviewing a lobbyist in Washington who said that he thought the effect of all this money was gridlock, because he explained to me that the lobbyists, least happy outcome is a resolution to a problem, because then you've lobbied your way out of a job. So it's much better if you can just continually have conflict and nothing resolved. So year after year, he tried to gum up the works. So there's that too.
You remind me of the old story about a single lawyer in a small town starves. Two lawyers in a small town both live large.
Steve?
I want the panel to comment. It seems to me, first one has to differentiate.
Talk to the microphone, please.
Where foundations are giving their money as opposed to foundations that are programmatic versus foundations that are supporting issues. But the comment I'd like from the panel relates to, I think what Jane was beginning to talk about is the money and the amount of money and gridlock, particularly the perpetual campaign that money has, fundraising, and the degree to which the amount of money is now being used for negative campaigning, which is a tantamount to character assassination, where you don't know exactly what the motivation is, but it's not talking about policy, and therefore we don't have that debate. We have more of a environment in which it's to make sure government doesn't work.
Yeah. Any comments about that? Any answers? Adam, you look like you're about to say something.
Negative campaigning is not a new phenomenon. I mean, that's been going on, and character assassination in elections is
the 17th
obviously
century.
is a tradition, well-honed tradition. The permanent campaign, a part of that, I think, is that the parties have gotten weaker, and maybe it goes to the point that Steve was making also. There are so many factions invading the legislative halls and who have access to us through lots of forms of communications and lots of ways of organizing their message. And I do think that we suffer terribly from the fact that the campaign never ends. I don't know how you would solve that, because it's related to speech in some way, and we run into that problem again. But I think it's a great point, and I don't know how to solve it.
Well, I think you've described the paradox, which is that more and more energy and resources are being sucked into politics, and our political system is less and less effective in dealing with problems. The more that we spend on politics, the less effective the political system is. The problem is, I don't see a way out.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and I'm concerned, and maybe this has been going on for some time, but that the permanent campaign is not just about elections at all. And so what you see is a tremendous amount of money spent, most of it, again, undisclosed through front groups that you can't, as a reporter, I spend hours trying to trace the money back. And it's really hard, and you often can't get to the bottom of it, but it's on issues. So, you know, if you look at something like Obama's health care proposal, there was an incredible amount of money against it, including from some companies that publicly supported it. Aetna, I think it was, that was on the list of supporters, and then only by accident there was this disclosure that on their annual report that showed they'd put something like $80 million against it through front groups that you couldn't trace. And I think it's making governing really hard. Certainly it's a constant fight, and I think it's, you know, it's certainly not just elections.
I want to be sure that questions get asked, and we've only got 10 or 15 more minutes left to ask the question, so please.
All right, hi, Jake Gellergoed with Democracy North Carolina, and my question is to Adam as the optimist on the panel, because I have a question about how do we have solutions and how do we get things done. And I think you touched really well on the idea of redistricting reform as one of the pieces of fixing the problem. It's not a cure-all, but I think it is one of the pieces, and that you can't really separate the voting rights side of things from the money and politics side of things. And so what are some of the solutions we can look at? Is it disclosure? Is it online voter registration to make it more accessible? Is it dealing with voting rights issues here 50 years after the Voting Rights Act and that being stripped? What can we do to approach some solutions to fix these issues in the areas that are more winnable?
Yeah.
So it's a great question. I think that a number of the things that you mentioned are would be really critical. So access to the ballot for everybody who's eligible is really important. We've had some problems recently in North Carolina that were very egregious on this topic alone. But I want to come back and say, I think the most important thing that can be done has to do with the power of ideas. I mean, to develop and articulate policies to attract candidates, to teach them how to run for office with compelling messages for economic and for issues that people care about, that are going to relate to the voters' lives, and that people feel just fundamentally, if I vote for that person, they're going to go work for things I care about. The lack of the most important thing I think we can do is to come forward with compelling, convincing platforms supported by policies, by specific policy ideas. Communicate those effectively so that voters are motivated to turn out and to support those candidates. This can be done. I mean, we've talked a lot about how the negative speech and the destruction of character has turned people off, and it has, and appropriately so. But there is a reverse side, and it can be done. And I happen to believe that that's the most powerful thing that we could do. Whatever your belief, I mean, whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever, get your candidate out there and get him or her with some ideas. And let's run and have a real discussion about what we're going to do.
Next question or comment.
I'm Bill Stokes, and just a number of issues seem to be up. Somehow we've confused freedom of speech with the freedom of the checkbook, and I wonder if it's kind of discouraging to see smart people sit at a panel and go, I don't know what you do. I wonder if there's a place for some kind of a common fund where people with big money and anonymity want to enjoy those sort of privileges, pay into a common fund that then is used equally among all the candidates, and that things that are more partisan will be governed with some sort of restrictions. We seem to have found a way to restrict speech in certain cases 60 days before an election. I also, you guys that understand the tax rules maybe better than I do, I don't think it's complete to say that C4s don't have tax advantages if they're not paying gift tax. So people are going to give, as you said, you're going to net out the tax advantage. So if there's no deduction, you'll give the tax adjusted amount. If there's a bigger deduction or a credit, you'll rise to whatever that is. But I'd be interested more in your thoughts on the possibilities of some sort of a common fund that then provides maybe more quality of access. I think what I'm concerned about is that big money outside of the state that doesn't have registered voting standing in our state influences the outcomes of our elections. Thank you.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I think, that there are movements to try to pool smaller donations and to have matching amounts of money that would to enhance smaller donations.
Right.
I mean, I think there's a group called Democracy 21 that's talking about doing that, and I think Lawrence Lessig has talked about doing some of these things. I mean, there have been. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me also is that if you look at polls, one of the few issues where there's overwhelming bipartisan support is against the Citizens United decision and in favor of all kinds of campaign finance restrictions. This is not an issue that where the public, the majority rules, and so it's not it's not an issue that people usually cite as most important to them. But when you do ask them their opinion of it, it's a widely held view across the political spectrum that people in America don't really like the idea of unlimited spending that buries their voice. So,
Sonny.
So Helen or Sonny Ladd from the Sanford School. I want to go back to the very first question that was asked about mandating voting. For one thing, I can't understand how that would ever work, how the government, which is in, people don't trust, requiring people to vote, and what would happen if they didn't. But I have a suggestion along the same lines, and so I'd be interested in whether the panelists think this would affect how money is used. And that's to have the national government make Election Day every year a national holiday. Which would make it possible for many people who now work, can't get to the polls, to get there, and it would create tremendous spirit about voting. That's what you do on this national holiday. What are your thoughts?
I'm for it.
I would be totally for it. I mean, and you, Adam?
I think it's a great idea. I think that extended voting has some of the same effect. If you give people 10 days or 2 weeks to vote, it can have some of the same effect. It doesn't have the let's march to the polls together effect. But one of the benefits of extended voting is that people don't face lines, and that has a big salutary effect on people too. But the idea of anything that makes it easier for people to vote in general, I'm in favor of.
I mean, there have been other Bill Clinton suggested that people are issued photo IDs with their Social Security cards, so that there's not an issue of who's got a photo ID. There are civics programs. Arizona conservatives in Arizona are suggesting that you shouldn't be able to graduate unless you can sort of pass a basic civics test. But I mean, I do think, whatever your point of view, that probably the teaching is kind of deficient about how important this all is.
I'd only say this, and not to throw cold water on anything, but from the time I was in college a long time ago, we have been reforming our political system. I remember when the Democratic Party was going to make itself more democratic and representative by representing minority groups and women and so on at the conventions and so on. We reformed campaign finance in the 1970s. And all the way through this period, we've been enacting reforms in the political process. And here we are, something like 50 years later, saying, what can we do to fix this? So it's not that I'm a pessimist, it's that a lot of these reforms wind up being things that are very easy to circumvent, and they're not the panaceas that many people think they are.
Right.
I just think it's an endless struggle. I mean, you have to assume that every time, it's like fixing your roof. Every time you do one part of it, the other part leaks. I think that's just how you have to look at it. So,
It sounds like you're a real pessimist.
I have an old house.
Next question, comment.
Yes, I'm Mary Morgan. I'm a 1985 graduate of the Public Policy School. I just have a follow-up to the comment about making voting day a national holiday. That's the whole premise of kids voting, a 501c3 that many states have. North Carolina has it in some counties. And it's based on, and I can't remember the countries where this happens, where it is a holiday. It's a school holiday. Offices are closed. And so the adult has to take their child with them to the polling place. And so these children grow up going with their parent to vote. And the statistics on voting there are so much greater than in the United States. And they attribute it to the pattern of a child going to the voting booth each year with their parent. And so that 501c3 is working to try and make that happen here, at least increase participation.
Any comments on that? If not, next question or comment.
Good evening. My name is Kurt Lothman. First, a comment. In a recent Bloomberg TV interview with Nouriel, the economist Nouriel Roubini, and Tom Keene, Nouriel made the comment that there is a system in the United States is essentially legalized corruption when you think about it, and he was talking about the ability of moneyed parties to influence tax policy and so on. My question pertains to the role of media. The time frame has been mentioned about the last 40 years. Well, one of the things that's come along in the last 40 years has been the internet and the social media. Now, you can see a huge amount of sarcasm and cynicism regarding the political process there. There's also the established media. And my question is, what can we look for from the various media mechanisms to positively influence public policy?
You're in the media, Jane.
I'm thinking about it. I'm in the dinosaur part of the media, the long-form nonfiction, where at the New Yorker we still have people that are like monks with medieval manuscripts with pencils going through things. So I think that there certainly is, a democratization of voices because of the internet. It's gotten past elite places like the one where I work, and not all of it. I would say probably most of it's not my cup of tea, but I think it has potential, certainly, to bring information and involve people all around the world in discussions of all kinds of things. So, I'm more optimistic right now, though. I think it's had a huge effect between the internet and 24-hour cable on, again, making it hard to govern. It is as if you had constant critics watching you every second of your life, and it's tough. It's a very tough environment to look successful in. And I think that's true regardless of whether you're president or running a company or running a university or anything else. I think it's a 10 billion critics now, but I think it has potential. So.
What you said earlier about Democracy 21, Fred Wertheimer.
Fred Wertheimer.
Does that is patterned basically on picking up on what Obama's fundraising did in raising small amounts of money and trying to create a campaign out of that rather than relying on wealthy.
Well, the thinking is with the court as it is, you're not going to be able to limit money. So the alternative from the point of view of people who think there's too much concentrated money is let's dilute it,
right.
And put tons and tons of small donations out there.
Right.
But to tell you the truth, as covering these debates about this, where I see the intellectual edge going, at least to some extent right now, not from the liberal end, but the conservative end, or the sort of the, is much more for unlimited money and no disclosure.
Right.
Because there are people like, I don't know if you know Bradley Smith, who's a very smart lawyer who runs a thing called the Center for Competitive Campaigns, and he's very anti-regulatory about campaign finance, and he just thinks if you give money, you get picked on now. And so he's arguing that nobody should have to disclose your money. And he's been pretty successful in his earlier arguments.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it may go next.
Well, I think we have at least one more comment or question here.
I may have two.
Okay.
My name is Barry Katz. I'm a local citizen of Orange County. My first question really is to Adam. Adam, I recall when Citizen United's case was before the Supreme Court that the ACLU wrote an amicus in support of Citizen United, and that money and free speech were the same. Do you think that these days that the ACLU would take the same position they took then? Or how do you feel about the fact that the ACLU supported this decision?
Well, I have absolutely zero knowledge of what the ACLU would do today. I mean, I'm a donor and a supporter, but the great thing about the ACLU is I think they're right about 52% of the time. So I really don't know what the ACLU would do. I do think that there is, I personally think that there is a free speech issue. And that I am interested in constraining some of the money that goes into politics that's not, particularly that is not disclosed, because I think it undermines confidence in government. So I feel strongly about that. But I find myself coming and going, and I don't know how to solve the problem because I am concerned about people's right to spend money, articulating a point of view. I think people do have some right to anonymity under certain situations. Clearly not if they're trying to bribe somebody or, improperly influence, but if they're just trying to express a point of view, I'm loath to constrain that. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer or a clean answer, but those are the conflicts that I feel about this.
I really just wanted to hear you express your opinions on this issue. Thank you. Maybe some of you saw Thomas Edsel's editorial in the Times about the polarization that's gone on in this country, the polarization of citizens related to their political affiliations. I mean, one of the comments he was harping on was data that showed that in the 1980s, Democrats or Republicans, their concern about whether their child married somebody from the other party was somewhere in the 4 to 6% range, and that in 2010, it was closer to 50% where families felt seriously bent out of shape if their child were to marry someone who was affiliated with the other party. There's this polarization of the citizenry, and I think I want to hear comments whether or not the kind of policy statements that are issued by foundations, particularly on the right, that promote polarization in this country has had an effect on polarizing the citizenry and made governance that much more difficult. And this is a foundation-based concern that I have.
Jim?
I think that comes to you.
Yeah.
Well, I agree that the country is polarized. I don't agree that it was due to the right. Now, of course, if one side of a disagreement goes home, and that's what that they're expected to do, of course, you can have consensus. So the there is the possibility that we have a dysfunctional politics because we have a dysfunctional country. I'm not quite prepared to go that far as yet, but your point is well taken. My general view is that one of the causes of this is that we ask too much of government. We ask government to do things probably that either it doesn't do well or there's not enough consensus in the country to sustain those operations. I think I read recently that the Justice Department is trying to regulate the dating scene on college campuses. That's probably something better left to other institutions to deal with. And you could go on. We came out of World War II with a great deal of confidence in government. We'd won a war, we built an atomic bomb, we built the interstate commerce system, we did all sorts of other things, found a polio vaccine, and so on. But as we began to attack all these subsequent problems, beginning in the 1960s, government has not fared quite so well. They've created many problems along the way. So we have a disagreement, and that's fine. But as I say, I think one of the sources of the problem is that we're asking more things of government than government can deliver, and we're routinely disappointed with what happens.
The Dean gets the last word, and we welcome you.
Well, thank you. You know, I was wondering if there was some area of life that might be a parallel to what we're seeing in politics. And the thing that came into my mind is the futile cycle that people get into with addiction. And here's what made me think about this. So you think about people get addicted to a drug, let's say, and then they take the drug not so much because they're expecting some positive effect from it, but because they're fearful of the negative effect of not having the drug, and you go through withdrawal. And it seems to me giving money to politics must feel like that these days, that if you get your people into office, it's not that you're expecting any beneficial outcome because government's dysfunctional for the most part, but you're really worried that there will be a terrible outcome if the other people get into office. So you give. You know, tolerance is another part of taking drugs. You need more and more over time to get the same benefit. That's very much like giving to political campaigns, because now you need to give a lot more in order to accomplish the same effect. But the parallel that seems most obvious to me here is that, you know, the lore is that in order to get over an addiction, you need to hit rock bottom. And I wonder if we just haven't hit rock bottom yet with dysfunctional politics to get people's attention enough to make these reforms that seem so obvious to be made. And so, you know, who knows? Maybe we're just in this downward spiral with dysfunctional politics. At some point, we will perceive that we've hit rock bottom, and then that will be the stimulus for doing some of the things that need to be done. So I don't know if that analogy makes any sense, but I thought I would throw it out.
Well, now you're talking.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kelly, for giving us an upbeat answer, positive answer to the problem that we've all been discussing here, and without success in coming up with any optimistic answers. But in any event, that's a great contribution. And let me just say that I think that your support of this conference and panel this afternoon, we greatly appreciate that. It is an important contribution. Kristen, it wouldn't have happened but Kristen's ideas. It wouldn't have happened if Adam and Jim and Jane hadn't agreed to come here, and all the scholars who are here tomorrow who are going to figure out what the answers are.